Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam.
And my name is Kelly. Today, I have the honor of being our first case of the new year. I wish all of you nothing but the best. And I'm going to ring us into the year with a very perplexing mystery and several deaths at the infamous Cecil Hotel. Before I tell you all about what I've been researching, instead of a question, we wanted to discuss a 2023 year in review, which seems a place to express our sincere gratitude, especially to early friends of the pod.
Yeah, we would like to thank the Prosecutors podcast for tweeting out our first episode, The Lane Bryant Murders, and for Kelly's dad for sharing his experience in Danny Green in episode 6. My sister Ash for bringing us the story of the Paulding Light and our experiences there in episode 13. Insane Investigation for helping bring us our 20th episode about songs about true crime or songs about murder. My mom for her experience talking about the Tylenol murders in our two-parter episodes 36 and 38. And finally, we'd like to thank Kendall and VR Welpton agreeing to an interview and having a really fun conversation about paranormal investigations along with their documentary, The Haunting Lodge.
It's been really fun. And again, yes, thank you to everyone there for welcoming us into this podcast community. It seems wild that it's been close to a year now since we've started.
Yeah, first week of February will be our first year.
Oh my gosh, a whole year. So I can't wait to tell you guys all about this and Sam to tell you all about it because I haven't told Sam any of this. I finished a book over the holidays and it has been the genesis of this episode. So, without further ado, let me bring you our first case of 2024. You may have heard of the Cecil Hotel, you may not have. So let me set the scene for you. The Cecil was originally intended to be a glamorous big spot for the public to retire when it opened in 1924. The hotel is in downtown Los Angeles on Main Street, and it was initially built on the site of the city's Skid Row, so not an awesome location for a big hotel, but a central one. It originally held 600 rooms. When it opened, it was sort of understood that Skid Row would be pushed back a block so that the hotel was not, quote, on Skid Row, but next to it, which still isn't a big selling point considering you're just a block away from a large amount of the city's unhoused population, drug users, and the mentally ill, who were often both.
I was going to say, one block isn't that much of a difference.
I know, right? I was like, how did nobody think about this when they built this place? Like,
I guess it's the whole idea of out of sight, out of mind if they're not like right in front of the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that is probably what they were thinking.
Exactly. And maybe they thought they could keep them away from the building. I don't know why they would have thought that, because it's, as we'll hear and will become important, there's only one guest entrance to the Cecil Hotel. So pretty much, I mean, there wasn't like a place for a second lobby. There's only a door in the back, which we'll talk a little bit about. But you would literally step right into the Cecil's lobby off Skid Row, essentially. You could literally be doing drugs in their alley and walk into the Cecil's lobby. So, not positive. Maybe, like Sam and I's prior job together, it was just too big and too beautiful. And in the wrong spot.
They're also coming to the point of like, let's just move them to the side versus attempting to help.
And as far as I read, there was no like formal notification to these people of Skid Row that the hotel would be built. It was just like one day, I'm sure, the construction crew turned up. And to my
Yeah,
knowledge,
that's not a requirement.
no, it's not.
Like, that's not residence. That's not even like eminent
Exactly.
domain or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
imagine that you're somebody who is unhomed, just trying to live day by day on your feet, and
Right.
suddenly you're forced out of the one place that you essentially do call home.
Right, exactly. Like there so that's why I said it was understood that the Skid Row would be pushed back. But it's not like they put up like signs on telephone poles or anything like please vacate the area, like nothing like that.
Yeah, that doesn't really happen. It's a courtesy if it does.
Yeah, and not helping matters. In 1924, everything looked full of promise to the Cecil's original team, despite the location. However, in 1929, the Great Depression hit.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're looking at a hotel in the middle of what was already Skid Row, and now it's the Depression. And we can't be sure if this is what led to the Cecil's descent into one of the most infamous hotels in Los Angeles, but it certainly didn't help matters, as we've been saying. However, it may have been the catalyst to the hotel being dubbed the Death Hotel. Not great.
So yeah, I've heard that before.
Yes, yes. So if y'all have ever heard of anything like that, the Death Hotel, Hotel Death, anything sort of like that, a lot of it is referring to the Cecil because quickly, it seemed, people at the hotel saw it as their final resting place, with the first documented suicide at the Cecil being in 1931, and then one followed in 1934, and one in 1962. And those are only three of these suicides. In the last case, a woman jumped to her death from a window in the hotel and landed on a pedestrian on the street, and both were killed instantly.
Yeah, I think I've read about that one before. It's very sad.
It's very sad and really wild, and kind of gives you a little visibility, you guys, into how old this hotel was. Because when you think about it now, you can't even crack a hotel room or crack a window in most hotel rooms these days.
A lot of it's because of cases like this.
Exactly. So it's important to know that the Cecil did have these old windows that did open, and that's partially to blame for a lot of what we'll talk about. But it should be mentioned here as well that as we go further into this, you'll see that the Cecil was pretty much, I'm not sure at this time, in the 30s, in the 60s, kind of like that. But in the more modern era, around 2007, as we follow their general manager, we'll learn that the Cecil was basically operating just slightly above the red. So, like, they didn't have
Yeah.
improvements. Yeah, they didn't have the money to change out all these windows and make these improvements, which is kind of a catch-22 because you have the suicides and the deaths, but then also you can't afford to fix those windows.
Even today, if you look at videos of people who have gone to the Cecil and you just even look
Mm-hmm.
at the hallways, they look very
Mm-hmm.
run down. It kind of seems
Girl.
like it feels kind of like a college dorm to me that hasn't been well kept when you're in those hallways.
Yes. Yes. So Sam conjures a very good image for you guys. That is sort of the Cecil's destination. In 1924, we all think it's going to be great. In 1929, the Great Depression hits. And then from there, the Cecil kind of starts spiraling down, and it is eventually, in the state that we're going to follow its general manager. She is the one who wrote the book that is one of my primary sources that I'll talk about. And she said when she arrived at the Cecil, it was so incredibly run down, except for the lobby.
So the lobby looks gorgeous.
Yes, the lobby is still in fantastic condition, too, if you'd believe it. Like, they still have the original stained glass in the ceiling, and they still have a lot of the original marble. So from the lobby, it all looks really good. But then, according to this woman, and according to Sam's correct supposition from just seeing pictures, the interior was just very poorly kept. And I'll explain a few reasons for that. But she said she arrived and the carpet had like a noticeable smell. She said pretty much every surface was like tacky and basically just gross. And that's in our sort of modern era. I believe those statements were made in 2007. But jumping back, we're going to visit the mid-80s here. In a Netflix documentary on the hotel, it was called the place where, quote, serial killers went to let their hair down, end quote. The speaker was also not wrong about serial killers frequenting the hotel. It was believed and it was alleged that Richard Ramirez, who came to be known as the Night Stalker, stayed in the Cecil for an extended period of time in 1985. This would have been toward the end of Ramirez's reign of terror, where he killed at least 14 people and attacked dozens more before his capture, which was also in 1985. And just like we just discussed, Kim Cooper is sort of explaining it. She now conducts tours of the Cecil, and she claimed that Richard Ramirez had stayed there not to prey on victims, but because he fit in. By this time in the Cecil's history, it had transformed from a grand hotel into essentially part of Skid Row, and this was due in part to its tenant arrangements, which we'll discuss in just a moment.
If I remember right, Ramirez would come back from his attacks and his murders and like take all of his clothes off in the parking lot or outside and basically walk in his underwear because no one would bat an eye. And that he wouldn't be covered in blood coming in.
Yes, and you speak well of a truth of the Cecil in that even in the 80s, it was not weird if you were in the Cecil to see somebody just wandering through the lobby in their underwear. And here's where we sort of hit the rub of having only one entrance and its tenant arrangements. Because rather than a full hotel of those 600 rooms, part of the building had been given over to residential housing where, rather than guests, the occupants were renting the room from the hotel for a longer stay, basically as long as they could pay for.
And that's not super uncommon. That a lot of hotels actually have things like this.
Correct, and especially for the time, it's not incredibly uncommon, especially since, like I said, ever since it had opened, basically, the Cecil was starting to operate sort of just above that red. So I'm sure that at some point it was agreed upon, like, oh, this will be a good way to make money, arranging these longer term stays.
Yeah, I know somebody who did that kind of for a while.
Yeah.
He did it for school.
Yeah.
His school actually overbooked their dorms, so the school rented out a floor of a hotel, and that turned into dorms.
Yes,
So yeah, my friend, he loved it. He was in there. He got room service. He had housekeeping. He's like, this is the best dorm of my life.
Exactly. And it's so funny that you mentioned that because there was a program at one point to take what they tried doing was partitioning floors off And that was part of the arrival of the general manager, and they started packaging certain floors of the building to be leased out to arrangements just like that, to like local colleges. They also said they toured rehab facilities to bring their sober patients there as transitional housing. Lots of different stuff like that. But you can see how this might be a problem if you're a regular guest at the hotel and you're sharing the same lobby as someone who lives there, and the sort of person who seemed to frequent the Cecil. You run into the issue of a guest who's perhaps paying more for their stay running into somebody in their underwear in the lobby.
Yeah, it's who are they catering to for that long-term living?
Right. And I think that's
versus who they're catering to for a hotel.
Yes. And I think that is a huge part of the problem that they encountered here, because the problem is there's not a lot of good ways to fix the Cecil, because we're going to talk about her. Her name is Amy Price. She wrote the book Behind the Door, which is what I read in the backseat on the way home from the holiday and spawned this episode. Amy Price arrives at the hotel in 2007, and they're just starting to work out this arrangement. Basically, what had happened is all the people who were tenants or were tenanted had been moved to a specific floor. In this case, I believe it was floors 2 and 3. They had gathered these sort of long-term tenants in, which was a conscious decision on their part to be able to start to let more rooms become available for hotel guests. So that was very much in play, but like we said about the windows, we're going to see in the future a couple other problems, but the Cecil had been legally agreed upon by a prior owner as a residential hotel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I didn't know this. That you could, first of all, that you could designate a hotel as residential or anything like that, but also their status as a residential hotel made it difficult to get permission from the city to do any new construction, to do any new thing. It was a whole hoot and holler with the city.
Yeah, it's part of like the tenant rights.
Exactly. Yeah. They kind of had a tug of war relationship where they're trying to improve this place, but they don't really have the ability, and they had grand visions for rehabbing the hotel and adding a second entrance that went to the same elevator bay as the regular lobby, so hotel guests could come through one, tenants could come through another. However, they would still be sharing the same elevator, as again, that's a big construction thing. So more costs added there and more approval required from the city that was not forthcoming at all. And so that made it tough on them. And also, I should here mention that another big improvement that the Cecil had not made was the Cecil is not air conditioned at all. Or heated.
Oh, still? Wow.
Yes, it was not. Was not.
That doesn't sound comfortable in LA.
Absolutely. It was in 2007, from the time Amy Price arrives there until the time she leaves. She's there for 10 years, and there's still no heating and cooling in the building by the time she leaves, because it's another gigantic construction expense that you would have to work out with the city and have to do. But it was also a problem for the Cecil because that's considered a basic amenity, heating and cooling in your room. So this is kind of another example of what's really pinning them down and why they can't make this hotel work, for anything besides what it becomes, in my opinion.
Is Amy Price, well, is she the same person that is mainly interviewed in the Netflix documentary as the
Yes,
manager?
ma'am. Yes,
Okay, I
ma'am.
wasn't
I
sure if there were
was.
two different managers there or not, but I do remember her
No.
from the documentary.
Yes, I was going to mention that as we got to sort of her protagonist storyline here, because she was interviewed for a Netflix documentary on the Cecil Hotel. You can check it out. However, in her book, I have not checked out the Netflix documentary on this because Amy Price, in the book, she was not fully aware of what the topic of the documentary was going to be. Amy Price very much saw herself as like a matriarch of the Cecil and like its caretaker, and she really thought the documentary was going to be about the history of the hotel and rehabbing it.
You can kind of tell through her interviews that that's what she thought.
Correct.
You can
Yeah,
kind of tell
that's
in
from what
there.
I've heard. People said, she also mentioned in her book, people perceived her as like quite cold, and some even accused her of the infamous crime that we will discuss, but some people even said she may have done it. And I was like, good Lord, people, like, the suppositions there are astounding. Like, she was just doing her job.
See, I didn't get any of that out of the documentary. I got more of she lacked the experience for taking
Yes.
over that specific hotel, and she had super high hopes
Mm-hmm.
and nothing went as planned, and she was
Yes.
way too in over her head. That was my impression of her in that documentary.
You've gathered about what it is, what the story is, the real story there with Amy Price, which was she came onto this job with the Cecil Hotel with the understanding that she would be working for the Cecil for 6 months, rehabbing one room of the Cecil to mirror a popular hotel chain's format, in the hopes that this
Mm-hmm.
popular hotel chain would buy the Cecil and they could make these improvements. However, that failed to materialize, and Amy Price just became known as sort of the go-to girl, and she was handling a lot of different stuff, and that led to her staying at the Cecil for 10 years.
And I get that. I've it not to this extent by any means, but I've had jobs where I've been transferred to fix
Mm-hmm.
something and it's not
Mm-hmm.
what you expect. And I've left jobs because that transfer, which was supposed to be like a big deal and I was supposed to like come in and rehab something and like
Mm-hmm.
completely turn around a store and start profiting. It was like
Right.
you what you all are asking for is far too much than what I am capable of, and you need a team, not one person. And I've walked away
Yes.
from jobs because of that exact thing. So I understand that concept, or it's like you have these high hopes, you want to go in,
Mm-hmm.
you want to be that person to kind of save it, and it's just
Yeah.
sometimes you just can't.
Exactly. And that you've really gathered Amy Price's situation. She came in with the most positive of attitudes and was ready to help this hotel. But like we mentioned, she could have never predicted running into the crazy roadblocks she does, which one of the first being that tons of her renovation work was stymied with a lawsuit with the city of Los Angeles, which they eventually lost to the city of Los Angeles to get the residential housing moniker removed from the Cecil so they could add air conditioning. Like, that was the whole lawsuit. Like, they wanted to add air conditioning, like heating and cooling, and make basic, sort of, I mean, they would be large capital investments, but long term for the hotel, it would hopefully turn it into a moneymaker. But
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of the times, like you just said, when you get transferred, sometimes it's beyond saving because Amy Price herself, several times in the book, drew comparisons between the Cecil Hotel and the Titanic. She 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 very much had the sense that she was just aboard it a sinking ship.
Yeah, hey, I've been there. I've been there multiple times. I get it.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I've had 2 of my stores shut down because there was no help to it
Mm-hmm.
after I left. I get
Yep.
it.
Yep. And so these people at this time are still renting these rooms for a longer stay, basically as long as they can pay for. And by this time, the Cecil would also be quite cheap because we're now in the 80s, and the neighborhood of Los Angeles has evolved. The hotel hasn't necessarily. And so it was known as a place where, quote, pensioners, single people, drug and alcohol users would stay. And according to Kim Cooper, who gives the tours, it became, quote, just where poor people lived.
Yeah, they probably had like weekly or monthly rentals that were a couple hundred
Yes, ma'am.
bucks.
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to what we deal with as regular tenants with our landlords, except the Cecil was their landlord. And as these tenants moved in, the earlier they moved in, obviously, the lower their rent was.
Yeah,
So,
probably got grandfathered into different places.
yes, exactly. They got grandfathered in, and you can see how this pinches them in a really tight spot because you're essentially, having to wait out these people who are official tenants of the building, which is not necessarily the best strategy as far as hotels go. Like,
Right.
well, we're just going to wait for 2 floors worth of tenants to either choose to move out, which why would they? Because I'll give you an example. In 2013, there was an area that was just called the female dorms, and you could rent a room for the night in this female dorm for $35, and you would have a shared bathroom situation going on.
That's basically a hostel. I've stayed in places like that before.
Correct. Yes. Pretty much hostel-like. Like, not all of these rooms have bathrooms. They definitely don't have kitchens or anything like that. So it's cheap. $35 a night. And I'm quoting that $35 a night from 2013. So that's hard to
I'm
beat.
pretty sure it would have been 2012, 2013 for me, but I stayed in a place just like this in San Francisco at that time. It was like there were just like a room of bunk beds, and then there was a common kitchen and a common room bathroom and like a common room lounge. Yeah, it was 2012, 2013. I stayed in a place like that in San Francisco.
Exactly. And so this female dorm was, just like you said, rows of bunk beds. And there were 6 bunk beds in the female room. So you're talking 12 people staying in that room.
Yeah, and usually there's like lockers or something. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, then, like I said, you're talking shared bathroom facilities, shared showers, that kind of thing.
Hey, if you're young and traveling, and that could be a great solution.
Absolutely. I was just about to say, if you're young and traveling, hostels are a great option. And Amy Price's long-term vision, along with her original business partners, was to make the Cecil sort of a new, modern, nice hostel for travelers. Like, that was her grand plan, was to make these hostel rooms, which, like you just said, it sounds ideal for her, right? But
it was fantastic for us in San Francisco. Like, you have to be smart. Like, you have to know your surroundings and all of that. But like, that was my only time staying in a hostel in the States. But in Europe, even when I was studying abroad, I can't even tell you how many hostels I stayed in across Europe because it's super cheap. And it's like, when you're there for a semester, like, you want to do as much traveling as you can. We would try to get out on weekends and go explore different areas of the continent or the countries that we were in.
Absolutely. And so you can see why, like, downtown LA, hip new hostel, it all sounds great until you get to this struggle with the city and with the tenant arrangements to where you can't really make improvements.
Mm-hmm.
So like Cooper said, it had become just where poor people lived. However, in 1991, another serial killer, Jack Unterweger, made the Cecil his home. He had murdered people in multiple different countries. He was an Austrian journalist and allegedly picked the Cecil because it was linked to Richard Ramirez. He was known to target sex workers and had killed them in Austria, the Czech Republic, and then Los Angeles when he arrived in the U.S.
Yeah, I've heard of him before, and it's just that
Yes.
the fact that like people are like, "Oh, Richard Ramirez stand here. I want to follow in his footsteps."
Exactly. Do you
Like,
believe that? So, yeah, so this guy is like, ooh, I want to mirror that. And then there's a whole chapter in the book literally just titled Tragedy Tourism, because after the larger crimes that we'll talk about happened, they would get almost like an influx of people interested in staying in the hotel to be around where these serial killers had been or where these crimes had happened. I wouldn't personally do it myself, but
yeah, that's like murderbelia type of
yes,
territory.
I was gonna say it's verging on murderabilia for me. Like just going somewhere because of the shocking deaths that have happened. I That's borderline murderabilia for me. I feel like it's a different story if you are visiting a city from out of town and you want to go on like their haunted tour like
I was
that.
gonna say, like you, as you all know from recent conversations that we've had on the show, I'm fascinated with paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
I've stayed at places just because of the rumors of them being paranormal.
Right.
This is a different thing, in my opinion,
Correct.
because like this is so recent history of real tragedy that it's hard to get past in my
It
head.
is. It is. And it's so recent. You're right. Like the tragedies at the Cecil go like right up until recently. And Amy Price in her book said that these people were just drawn to the hotel because the crimes had been committed there. And yeah, I think doing a walking tour of a haunted area is entirely different than checking yourself into a hotel to purposefully go see crime scene areas, most of which have been cordoned off from guests and forbidden entry to.
Yeah, that doesn't appeal to me.
Me neither. The Cecil has also been woven into the lore of a case that is very public and one of the ones I follow to this day. I hope to cover it at some point, but I'm biding my time. The case of which I'm speaking, and of which Amy Price did not speak of in her book, is that of Elizabeth Short, who is better known to the public as the Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short went missing from the Biltmore Hotel, which is also in downtown Los Angeles. Despite this fact, a lot of people believe the last place Short was seen was at the bar of the Cecil Hotel. But we've been able to trace that this rumor is derived from a police report by LAPD officer Muriel McBride, who noted that she encountered a young woman who left a bar on Main Street in downtown Los Angeles and had claimed that someone threatened to kill her. When McBride saw photos of Elizabeth Short, she reportedly didn't identify her as the woman she spoke with on the evening in question. It's also worth noting that McBride didn't specifically reference the Cecil Hotel bar in her report.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. So, still though, the legend has become that Short did indeed visit the infamous location before disappearing. Short would later be brutally, viciously murdered in Los Angeles, and her body was in such horrific conditions when it was found, it quickly drew comparison with Jack the Ripper's victims.
Yeah, I really want to read Steve Hodell's book on Black Dahlia.
I think I've read that one. The Black Dahlia Avenger?
I don't remember the name of it, but it's the son of one of like
Yes.
the main suspects wrote it because he thinks his
Yes.
dad was
Yes.
the murderer. I'm very interested to read that. It's on my list.
Correct. Yes, I am fascinated by the Black Dahlia, and like I said, I will hopefully cover her at some point because I think stuff's getting lost to history that shouldn't be. And I feel like it's sort of becoming a kind of Jack the Ripper victim situation where they've just become part of this lore, part of this story, and not something that we're necessarily looking into anymore. But on the topic of books, if you're looking for a true crime book about Jack the Ripper, I highly recommend The Five. And that is
I've heard of that one.
It is very good. It is in reference to the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, the 5 that have been identified as coming from him. And the subtitle of this book is The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper. And it is by Hallie Rubenhold. You can get it on Amazon, basically anywhere books are. And that is going to show you sort of a different perspective of the Jack the Ripper story. Because it's been dissected in so many ways that this book, The Five, is a very new kind of concept where it follows what the lives of these women who were murdered by him would have been living. These lives that they had, these lives and conditions that they had to deal with. Because, not to get too much off on a tangent, but The Five does focus on the fact that even though it's commonly been said by a ton of people, almost everybody, that Jack the Ripper's victims were sex workers. There is no, according to the book The Five, there is no official record, documentation, arrests, anything like that of these 5 women for solicitation, for sex work, for anything like that. None of the 5 women had that in their background.
Yeah, I strongly recommend listening to Morbid's coverage because they use that book as a reference.
Yeah.
And they go really deep into just what day-to-day life was like for these women. And it's incredibly interesting. They have more of a breakdown than I've ever seen in the case in that way. I highly recommend it.
You're right. You're right. Definitely listen to Morbid's coverage. As always, their stuff is impeccably put together. And if you are of the reading type, I highly suggest that you grab The Five. It's a really good one. So, like we were just talking about, Amy Price, she arrived at the hotel in 2007 to help rehab its image. Like I said, she had originally agreed to the job, and I was wrong originally. It was planned to last just 3 months instead of the 6 that I said before. And in these 3 months, she would be rehabbing that one specific room to hopefully attract a large hotel chain into buying the Cecil. And she wouldn't yet contemplate how she would be drawn in by the Cecil and end up staying there for 10 years. To give you just a little more insight, during Amy Price's 10-year tenure as the Cecil's brand manager, eventually elevated to general manager, more than 80 people died. So...
yeah, that's a lot.
10 years, yeah, exactly. 10 years, 80 people dead. Oh my gosh. I can't even imagine. Like, I'll talk a little more about some of the stuff that became, like, part of her day-to-day job. And I can't even imagine in 1 year that you're working there, you would have to deal with maybe 8 separate deaths.
Yeah.
That's bananas. And like I said, her book Behind the Door is excellent. And like it's a large primary source for a lot of information in this research. However, I have looked into it. I looked into other articles, tried to bring you a fuller picture. But when Amy arrived, she was received by a man named Pedro, and he is only referred to that as in the book, so that's how I'll be referring to him. Going forward, the names in here are as written in Amy Price's book Behind the Door, because I imagine she reached out to them and that's how they preferred to be referred to. So I'll be using those.
Yeah, I think Pedro was also in the Netflix documentary.
He could be. I know for sure that there is a maintenance man on there that is interviewed. I believe it might be Santiago. We'll talk about him.
Oh, that might be who I'm
in a little bit.
Thinking of. Maybe they. I haven't watched it. I watched it right as it came out, which was what, 2-3 years ago at this point.
Yeah, something like that. And the book just came out this year. That's why I read it, because I was like, okay, well, the Netflix documentary came out a little bit ago. This book came out right now. I don't know if any big time documentary yet has gotten to Pedro. I do know that one of the maintenance men gave testimony. He was on the Netflix documentary and answered questions.
I do remember Santiago, because this was in relation to Elisa Lam that he was interviewed.
Correct. And that's one of the big ones we're going to talk about. But also, I have so much more to tell you. So I don't think that Netflix has yet reached Pedro, which is a damn shame, because Pedro was known to be sort of the hotel historian, like the unofficial historian. He had worked at the hotel since 1985. So it's a shame that Pedro wasn't on the Netflix documentary, or potentially Pedro was pitched the Netflix documentary and declined to participate. I don't know.
Which is entirely possible.
That's entirely possible, because both Pedro and Amy Price were very much interested in seeing the Cecil through, in like stewarding it, and like I said, she referred to herself as a matriarch of the Cecil. So I can see why Pedro might have turned it down, not knowing how Netflix would edit it. But I also see why Amy Price said yes, not knowing how Netflix might edit it.
Mm-hmm.
So Pedro had been present for so many deaths that he had even been questioned before regarding a fight between two lovers that got bloody in the Cecil. And Price and Pedro were thick as thieves, and she goes on to mention in her book, and this is coming back to what we were talking about just a second ago. In her book, she describes that the hotel was almost constantly being sued, and she came to consider giving depositions in court regularly as just part of her job.
Yeah, I remember in the documentary, she's just like, it was common to call the police multiple times a day.
Yes. Several times in the book, she mentions incidents, call the police from the Cecil, and a lot of the times when they called them, they either didn't come, or they would come hours later, or you would have to call them more than once. And so Amy Price and the staff came to understand that they would have to start telling the police, like, there was an emergency right then, active now. And if you didn't tell them that, and your call came from the Cecil, cops were really likely to turn their head the other way. Because, again, it's not in a good neighborhood.
Right.
It's now not in a good neighborhood anymore. So, yeah, I just can't imagine that being part of your job description regularly, day to day. Like, okay, I gotta go back to court. I know I was just Pedro describes driving Amy to court several times, and that it was definitely regular. And so here, I'm going to discuss arguably the biggest modern case that happened at the Cecil. And the reason I wouldn't normally touch it, because it is a very well-known case. We've already mentioned the name. It's already come up. If you don't know it, you're going to know it here shortly. Because I think this is a very cool perspective to put on it. Because Amy Price was behind the desk of the Cecil and she was acting as general manager when a 21-year-old Asian woman named Elisa Lam vanished. And she had a room at the Cecil. Price had been on the job at the hotel for 5 years, and she was accustomed to the regular mental illness that was on display at the hotel, including but not limited to people running through the common areas naked, like we said, and even to having things thrown at her. So the Cecil is really gone downhill at this point because she's accustomed to ducking drinks being hucked at her.
Mm-hmm.
So Price was not officially alerted, nor did she hear about Elisa Lam until she talked with the representative at the front desk who received a complaint connected to her room, number 506. According to the guest, she'd begun leaving post-it notes on the other guests' beds that said things like, "Go home." That's because this was possible because room 506 was the female dorm that we discussed before. So there's 6 bunk beds inside there, and they were the cheapest in the hotel, as you might rightly expect, given that 12 people would be sharing the room. And a lot of people who were staying there were on a budget. So she's leaving post-it notes on their beds. The front desk agent then also told Price that there had been other complaints regarding Elisa. According to the 11 other people in the dorm, Lam had begun to lock the door to them and ask them the password to enter. Like I said, I feel like much of Elisa's death has been dissected in a million ways by Reddit and Netflix documentaries and the nationwide fervor that occurred when Lam was discovered missing. But I do want to give you a little more information on it so you can appreciate that Amy called Elisa Lam's death not even the most haunting case she was a part of in her time there. And we'll be discussing that one in the details that I have on it.
Yeah, I'm curious as what she's going to say, because I have some strong feelings on what happened to Elisa Lam that doesn't necessarily coincide with what a lot of other people believe. And so I'm curious to see what she says.
Exactly. I'm just going to recount Amy's position on Elisa Lam, and we all can form our own opinion based around that. But I think just a little more context from Amy's point of view and her closeness to the Lam story will help paint how troubling the last case we discussed truly was to the woman who had become general manager of the Cecil. At the time of the complaints about Lam, Price's solution was to relocate her to her own room in hopes that she would no longer be disruptive. And it worked. This was at the end of January 2013. And then, so that's end of January. Then right around that, February 1st, 2013, Elisa Lam was officially reported as missing. Price discovered this when police arrived at the Cecil and said that Lam had not checked in with her parents, which was unlike her. Elisa was young, she was from Canada, and she was unfamiliar with the area, according to both her parents and police who informed Price of this that day. Price gave the line the hotel had become accustomed to giving law enforcement. Quote, "Let us know if there's anything we can do." Price says that when the police left, she thought that would be the end of the story, but it was far from over, as some of us may know. As I said, there was a nationwide alarm raised, and with it receiving so much press, Price heard a story from another employee. Apparently, at one point during her stay, this employee witnessed Lam run into the lobby and scream, "LA is crazy, and so am I," before running out. Given the Cecil's population and the events the staff had become aware of, this was considered actually quite innocuous. No one thought further about it due to their clientele, and this being pretty tame according to the staff. No one thought further until the police returned and stated they wanted to review the Cecil's video footage. And like we said, the Cecil is barely operating above the red. So that infamous video footage taken of Lam that you may have seen or is easily accessible on the internet, you can find it. It was shoddy and pixelated. And you'll be able to tell that by looking at it. And that's due to the Cecil not having the budget to do something as major as updating the security cameras. Price estimated that the cameras that recorded Lamb had been installed in the 1980s.
Yeah, it's definitely not the best footage, but also it's kind of on par with a lot of different businesses in reality. I
Yeah,
think the States overall kind of has the least quality cameras because we don't have CCTV like a lot of other countries do, at least not to the
yeah.
extent.
It's generally pretty poor footage that we receive, at least as the public, like going from certain things that have happened. I've seen some recent really good surveillance footage in relation to more modern cases, like ones that I can't turn away up from that I'm bugging Sam about. There's much better surveillance systems, and those tend to be on the outside of businesses just because they've had the budget to beef up security.
And it's 10 years later.
Exactly. And the Cecil didn't have money either way. They were never going to be able
And
to
I'm
renovate
not
these
sure if you'll
cameras.
get into it, but the camera footage is just odd
Mhm.
because it's clearly not the normal speed. And like you can tell that it's been shifted in some way.
I would imagine that could be the police altering it
I
because
believe so too. They deny it, but I believe that's a good possibility.
I don't want to say that there's anything wrong with that because I mean it'll happen just slower maybe than what was released to the public. I think it may have been a case of them because we will see that the the police are doing everything they can to solve this case because everybody it's exploding everywhere on the internet.
Well, yeah, I think it probably was more of let's get more eyes on it. Like if we do a alter, which is not really changing the footage, they're still
Mm-hmm.
providing it, that it
Mm-hmm.
gets more eyes on it because it seems a little more weird. But you can
Right.
see that there's a timestamp on the bottom. It's you can't read it; it's covered up, but you can see the seconds ticking. And I've seen videos of people slowing it down to actually match, like when it ticks, it's an actual second, and
Mm-hmm.
it has a very different feel in the footage.
Yeah, I would say that that's probably correct, a correct supposition from you, because in the investigation they get to a point where they're not sure where she is still, and they do release this video to the public. So maybe it was just like people have short attention spans. Like, let's get something tight out there that people can see and they know what's going on. It could be something like that. Price doesn't address it other than to say that the cameras were old and she estimated that they were installed in the 80s and we're now in 2013. That's sort of all she gives on that. But the footage that we've seen, it was not found until days after the police had been reviewing the hours of security footage from the hotel. At the time after this footage was found, police asked Price, quote, "Where does the trash go out?" After telling them where, Price asked why they'd be asking her that, and authorities explained to her that they had begun working the case after seeing this footage, and they thought that Elisa had not left the hotel. Their working theory at the time was that she had been murdered and hauled out in trash bags. It was then Price was brought another story about Lamb's time at the hotel. Price herself had installed vending machines in the Cecil, and according to the front desk, they had received a call from Elisa asking for some Coke. The employee explained to her that she could use the complimentary vending machines. However, according to that employee, Elisa told them it was not that sort of Coke she was looking for, and she then hung up the phone.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm. Price relayed all these stories to police. Employees began to be questioned, and a general state of unease was around the staff. After each of the Cecil's many employees was questioned, no new information was brought forward. Meanwhile, the days were passing, and Price admitted to being confused that if Elisa hadn't left the hotel, where had she gone?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, the dog is going nuts today. So search dogs were brought to the hotel, and one of them hit on Elisa's scent and followed it to the window and fire escape where the trail ended. Price thought maybe the hotel is going to be okay again because the trail had ended. But police decided at this time, like we said, to release the infamous surveillance footage, and the internet was in a furor trying to solve the mystery. As the internet blew up, police discovered and told Price that Elisa had been on medication and had most likely stopped taking it. Without this, she was prone to paranoia, but also prone to hiding. Price and her staff took new measures to search all over the Cecil, given this fact that she was prone to hiding, but they still turned up nothing. After that night, Price said less news coverage dominated the cycle, and the news vans had mostly moved on. Price thought she was going to, quote, catalog Elisa Lam as yet another guest who went missing from the Cecil. However, on Tuesday, February 19th, 2013, Pedro and one of the staff's maintenance men, Santiago, entered her office, and she remembered Santiago as looking, quote, petrified. So this is the man that I think could have been in the Netflix documentary.
Yeah, I know Santiago definitely was, and I can't remember if Pedro also was.
Mm-hmm.
Or they just mentioned him, because his name's minimally familiar. Like, I know him in the story.
Right. Yes. So he is the one of the staff's maintenance men. And Pedro was with him. Like I said, he said, Price, we have a problem. The missing girl is here. Price immediately asked where, and Pedro grimly responded, quote, the tank. Guests had complained of low water pressure, which had led Santiago to go to the roof and check the tank. This was apparently not uncommon. It was an old hotel, and sometimes there would be a clog that needed to be manually fixed. The tanks were operating on a gravity system which included a chain, and sometimes the chain would get caught. However, Santiago has just found Elisa. Price now had a grim duty. She called her mother first, and much was made of that, but it's not really relevant. But then...
Yeah, that doesn't seem like too crazy to me. And I remember them making a big deal about it.
Yeah. It was
I remember
they made something of it.
Yeah, no, well, the reason why I don't think it's a big deal is my sister was on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
That was she was an on-air radio host. Mm-hmm. And she actually had to announce that we were going to war after 9/11.
Oh,
like she had to cut off broadcast and announce it live on air. And she called my mom before she made that announcement.
Yeah.
So that's why I totally understand it. I know why my sister did that. I know that what she was mentally dealing with at that moment was she just needed to talk to her mom. Right, I get it. Exactly. I understand it.
I do too. And a lot is made of it, but in her book, Price just says that it was more of an impulse than anything. Instinct.
Exactly.
She just called her mom. But then she was the one to place the 911 call regarding the discovery of Elisa Lam's body. So Amy Price was intimately involved with this. I wanted to give you all that context into the hotel, Price's story, and Elisa Lam's story, so we can discuss what she called the most haunting case of her time at Cecil. It wasn't finding Lamb's body and alerting the authorities, but something completely different. The woman behind the door. And that is where I'm going to leave you for part 1 of the Cecil Hotel story, The Woman Behind the Door. We'll talk more about what case Price found most troubling, and we'll discuss a little more about the Cecil next time.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I know this one. I'm very curious to see what this is, because I know a lot of, as you can kind of tell through conversation, I know a lot about the history of the Cecil. I find it fascinating, but I don't know if I know what this next part's going to be.
Exactly, and that's why I wanted to cover it, because I'm sort of in the same boat as you are. I know a ton about the Cecil. I think a lot of true crime folks know a lot about the Cecil or know parts of things about the Cecil, but I had never heard this story before. And I'm excited to share it with all you guys because it is so odd.
Yeah, I think the story of Elisa Lamb kind of dominates a lot of the conversation because it
Right.
is odd. And when you dive into it and look at all of the different theories, it's very interesting. Um, I'll just tell you my view really quick. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it was mental illness. Unfortunately, I
Mm-hmm.
think that this was a very tragic accident that was out of her control due to her
Yeah.
medication imbalance. Um,
Yeah.
I don't think there was foul play.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you were to slow down that video to what it should properly be, it's pretty clear that she is having a psychotic break.
Yeah.
It's very sad. It makes me very sad. And it makes me sad that it got so sensationalized as well
Yeah.
and not really addressed as mental health.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately in complete agreement with you on that because Amy Price's story gives us just a little more context. I already thought that it was perhaps a mental illness issue, but the story from Amy sort of gives us just a little more context into kind of the clientele of the Cecil, what was considered on par for guests, and why they may not have pinged right away on Elisa. I didn't want to delve too deeply into her case because it's just so well covered. But
It is.
the fact is that you sort of have to mention it in this story because I never knew that Amy Price was the one who called 911. Like, I never knew any of that. And as it stands, the roof is inaccessible and off bounds to any guests. And like we talked about,
But that doesn't mean it's not difficult to get up there.
yes, it is difficult. Well, A, it's difficult to get up there, and B, you would be met immediately by like no trespassing. Like,
Well,
you
no,
need
it's not
to
difficult
court.
because it's a pretty easy fire escape to get up there.
Well, yes, it
There,
is,
I
but
highly recommend if you're interested in the case, check out Lord and Arts on YouTube. He actually goes to the Cecil and walks the hallways and shows you how to get up there.
that's part of the problem, though. The hotel doesn't like that or want that at
They
all.
don't, and I understand why they don't.
Because,
But that's why, like, John Lorden was interviewed for that Netflix documentary, so he's kind of become the armchair detective expert on it.
that's the problem that Amy Price was having at the Cecil was there were a ton of people like this who came to the hotel who would attempt to access the roof. It's, like you said, easily accessible. However, now it's clearly marked as out of bounds. It's easily accessible if you're willing to put yourself in a little bit of a dangerous situation.
And I think, unfortunately, Elisa did that.
Yes, exactly. You might be willing to do that if you are having a psychotic break, like you said. Or apparently if you're a young filmmaker, because Price detailed how she often had to remove young people with cameras trying to get around the tanks and climbing up to the roof, risking their lives and the lives of others on the fire escapes. And she even recounted 2 separate instances of people literally acting out the footage of Elisa
See, that's not
Lamb's.
okay. I
It's
will
not
say
okay
in
at all.
the John Lorden's footage, he doesn't go up there. He rented a room there. He actually just walked around the hallway with the camera, kind of vlogging. He didn't
Yeah,
put
see
himself
that?
in danger. He didn't put other people in danger.
Yeah, see that I get. That I get. What I don't get is putting yourself and others in danger by gaining access to this roof. And then I find it a special kind of ghoulish and creepy that they said they had people act out the footage of her, both like on the elevator. She found two separate filmmakers reenacting the footage with an actor, which I think
Yeah,
is
that's not
super
okay.
odd. I don't think it's okay either. I think it's super not cool. And then on top of that, trying to gain access to the roof, which is a barred area. You're not supposed to be up there because it is dangerous.
Hmm.
You could fall. And I think that's what happened to Elisa, which is so sad because she, like we just said, you might be willing to put yourself in a little bit more of a dangerous scenario if you are having a mental breakdown.
Yeah. And if you guys are interested in more of this conversation, let us know. Because you and I could talk about
Yeah.
this for a long time. So if you
Oh,
guys
yeah,
actually want us to
absolutely.
discuss it and have a full-on episode, we'll do it. You just got to let us know.
Absolutely, just let us know because there are different chapters I can go back and reference, different things like that. But I avoided dissecting it too much. However, I also didn't want to leave Elisa's story in the ether here when talking about the Cecil. I think it's, important to still draw attention to her memory. But
Hmm.
in the next one, we're going to discuss what, for me, it was a case I did not know, had no idea about. And you might not know it either. So that will
Yeah,
be
I'm
part
curious.
2. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at Have You Heard About This Case at gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.